I remember the moment like it just happened. My name's Claire. I'm 34, and honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and Daniel and I were sitting at our usual spot in the sunlit corner of the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of a jazz playlist he loved. We were talking about nothing in particular. Plans for the day, a movie we wanted to watch, and then it happened. I don't even remember why I said it, but the words slipped out. You're my safety net, you know? I smiled as I said it, thinking it was sweet. A compliment, really. I'd meant it as a testament to how safe he made me feel, how steady and reliable he was. But the smile that crossed Daniel's face didn't reach his eyes. He didn't say much, just a quiet, "Huh," before taking a sip of his coffee. And yet, something in the air shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable, like the quiet before, a storm. Daniel and I had been married for 5 years. Our love story wasn't some epic tale of passion and fireworks. It was quieter than that, steadier. After years of chaotic relationships and personal heartbreak, Daniel had felt like a refuge. He was patient, kind, and dependable. The kind of man who remembered to check the oil in my car and always made sure there was enough milk in the fridge. And maybe that's why I felt the need to say it, that he was my safety net. I thought it encapsulated everything I valued about him, about us. But as I sat there watching the way his hands tightened slightly around his coffee mug, I started to wonder if it meant something else entirely to him. Later that night, the words lingered in the air between us as we sat on the couch, a movie playing in the background that neither of us was really watching. Daniel broke the silence first. "You said something earlier," he began, his voice measured, like he was testing the waters. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "About me being your safety net," he said. "What did you mean by that?" I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "I don't know. It just means you make me feel safe. Isn't that a good thing?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. "Safe," he repeated, the word hanging between us. "Is that all I am to you? Safe?" I stared at him, caught off guard. "Of course not," I said quickly. "You know I love you." "Do I?" His tone was calm, almost too calm, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was overthinking it, but something about the way he was looking at me stopped me. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, and it made my chest ache. "Daniel, where is this coming from?" I asked, trying to reach for his hand, but he pulled it back gently. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked. "You called me your safety net like I'm just some kind of fallback for you. Do you have any idea how that sounds?" I opened my mouth to respond, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. Because the truth was, I didn't. I hadn't thought about how it sounded. To me, it had been a compliment, a way of expressing my gratitude for everything he'd given me, for the life we'd built together. But now, sitting here under his scrutiny, I wasn't so sure anymore. Daniel didn't wait for me to respond. He stood up, grabbing his mug and heading toward the kitchen. I sat frozen on the couch, replaying his words in my head. I wanted to follow him, to explain, but I didn't know where to start. Instead, I stayed there, staring blankly at the screen. The conversation didn't come up again. Not that night. Not the next day. Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. But something between us had shifted. I could feel it in the way he kissed me goodbye in the morning. A little too quick. Or in the silence that filled the spaces where we used to talk effortlessly. By the end of the week, I was desperate to fix things. I planned a dinner at home, his favorite, spaghetti carbonara, and a bottle of the wine we always shared on special occasions. When he walked through the door, his expression softened slightly at the sight of the table set for two. "This looks nice," he said, dropping his bag by the door. I smiled, relieved. I thought we could have a night to ourselves. Talk. Maybe? He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. We ate mostly in silence, the clinking of forks against plates louder than I remembered. I tried to steer the conversation toward safer topics, work, the weather, but it all felt forced. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Daniel," I started, setting my fork down. "About what I said last week." His fork paused mid-air, but he didn't look up. "What about it?" "I didn't mean it the way you think I did," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I wasn't trying to diminish what we have or reduce you to something like that. I was just trying to say how much you mean to me, how much I rely on you." He set his fork down slowly, finally meeting my gaze. "And that's the problem, Claire," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not just about what you said. It's about what it revealed." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "You rely on me," he repeated. "But do you love me for me? Or is it because I make you feel secure?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Of course I love you," I said, my voice rising with desperation. "How can you even ask that?" "Because I've been asking myself the same thing," he said, his tone sharp now. "And I keep coming back to the same question. If I wasn't this version of me, if I couldn't give you this life, would you still be here?" The words hit me like a slap. I felt my cheeks flush, anger and shame colliding in my chest. "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. "You know I didn't grow up with much. You know how hard I've worked to get here, to build something stable. And I get that," he said, leaning forward. "I do. But it's like everything we have, the house, the trips, the plans we've made. It's all built on me being your safety net. What happens if I'm not? What happens if I fall?" I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped short. What would happen? The question scared me because, deep down, I didn't know the answer. Daniel's question stayed with me long after he left the table. I sat there, in the quiet dining room, staring at the half-empty plates and untouched wine glasses, replaying his words. What happens if I fall? The weight of it settled in my chest like a stone. I thought back to the beginning of our relationship, trying to pinpoint the moment things had shifted, or if they ever had. Daniel wasn't wrong to ask the question. When we met, I was drowning. I was 28, and fresh out of a relationship that had gutted me. My ex, Greg, wasn't just emotionally unavailable. He was reckless with money, and with me. I'd supported us, both for 2 years, working long hours at a thankless job while he jumped from one half-baked idea to the next. By the end, I was broke, exhausted and angry, not just at him, but at myself for letting it happen. And then Daniel came along. We met at a mutual friend's wedding. He was nothing like Greg. Steady, grounded, the kind of man who asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. There was something soothing about his presence, like the hum of a well-oiled machine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. When he asked me out, I was hesitant. Part of me was terrified I'd fall into the same patterns, that I'd end up leaning on him too much. But Daniel didn't let that happen. Not at first, anyway. He encouraged me to find my footing, to rediscover the parts of myself I'd buried under years of stress and survival. And yet, as I sat there in our quiet dining room, I couldn't deny the truth. I had leaned on him, maybe too much. I cleaned, up the table mechanically, my thoughts swirling. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning as memories played in my mind like a film reel. I remembered the first time Daniel paid for dinner, how relieved I'd felt not to have to split the bill. I remembered the time I'd cried in his arms after a particularly bad day at work, how he'd held me and promised everything would be okay. I remembered the way he'd stepped up when I lost my job 2 years into our marriage, taking on extra shifts without a single complaint. And I remembered how easy it had been to let him carry the weight, to let him be the steady one while I found my balance. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Maybe I had come to rely on Daniel in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. But did that mean my love for him wasn't real? The next morning, I woke up early, determined to fix things. I made coffee and waited for Daniel to come downstairs. When he did, his expression was guarded, his movements deliberate. "Morning," I said softly, handing him a mug. "Morning," he replied, his voice neutral. We stood there in the kitchen, the silence between us thick and heavy. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I've been thinking," I began, my voice hesitant, "about what you said last night." He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady but unreadable. "And?" "You're right," I admitted, my stomach twisting at the words. "I have relied on you, maybe more than I should have. But that doesn't mean I don't love you, Daniel. It doesn't mean I don't see you for who you are." He raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "Then why does it feel like that's all I am to you?" "I don't know," I said, honestly. "Maybe because I've been too scared to admit how much I need you. Or maybe because I've been so focused on holding on to what we have that I've forgotten to show you how much you mean to me." Daniel set his mug down, crossing his arms. "So what are you saying? That you love me, but you don't know if it's enough?" The question stung, but I couldn't blame him for asking. "I'm saying I love you," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "And I know I've made mistakes. But I want to fix this. I want us to fix this." For a moment, he didn't say anything, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know, Claire," he said quietly. "I don't know if this is something we can fix." His words hit me like a physical blow, and for the first time, I realized just how fragile everything we'd built had become. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Daniel didn't leave, but he didn't stay in the way that mattered. His body was present, sitting at the table during meals, lying beside me in bed. But his mind felt distant, locked behind a wall I didn't know how to break through. We'd fallen into a rhythm of avoidance, polite smiles, surface-level conversation, and an unspoken agreement to keep everything running smoothly for the sake of appearances. But every time our eyes met, I saw the question lingering there, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Can we come back from this? I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and late nights, hoping to fill the void. It didn't help. Every time I walked through the door of our home, the weight of what was missing pressed down on me. One evening, about 2 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen, Daniel came home later than usual. I'd been sitting on the couch, flipping mindlessly through TV channels, when I heard the front door open. "Hey," I called, trying to sound casual. "Hey," he replied, setting his keys on the counter. I glanced at the clock. "Late meeting?" "Something like that," he said, his tone clipped. The air between us felt brittle, like it would shatter at the slightest provocation. I couldn't take it anymore. "Daniel," I began, standing up and walking toward him. "We can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." He turned to face me, his expression tired but guarded. "What do you want me to say, Claire? That I'm over it? That I'm not still questioning everything I thought I knew about us?" I don't expect you to just get over it, I said, my voice rising with frustration. But I need to know what you're feeling, what you're thinking. I can't fix this if I don't even know where we stand. He stared at me for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable. I've been thinking about us a lot, about how we got here, and I keep wondering, did I miss the signs? Was I so focused on being what you needed that I didn't see what you wanted? His words cut deeper than I expected, and I struggled to find the right response. You didn't miss anything, I said softly. I married you because I love you, because I wanted to build a life with you. But did you marry me for me? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. Or because I was the opposite of everything that hurt you before? The question hung in the air, sharp and painful. I opened my mouth to argue, to insist that my love for him was real. But the truth was, I didn't know how to convince him or myself. Because maybe there was a part of me that had chosen Daniel because he was safe, because he offered a kind of security I'd never known before. But did that make my love for him any less real? I don't have all the answers, I admitted, my voice trembling. But I know that I love you, Daniel. I know that I chose you because you make me better, because you make me happy. Isn't that enough? He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. It should be, Claire. God, I want it to be. But every time I think about what you said, about me being your safety net, I can't stop wondering if that's all I've ever been to you. A means to an end. You're not just that, I said, tears spilling over now. You're my partner, my best friend, the person I want to grow old with. How can you think I don't see you for who you are? Because you don't, he said, his voice rising now. You see the version of me that fits into your idea of stability, the version of me that can hold everything together when you can't. But what happens when I can't? What happens if I fall apart, Claire? Would you still be here then? I didn't know how to answer him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can keep doing this, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can keep wondering if I'm enough for you or if I ever was. And with that, he walked past me, leaving me alone in the quiet, empty room. The next few days passed in a haze. Daniel wasn't avoiding me exactly, but there was a distance between us that felt impossible to cross. He wasn't angry, at least, not outwardly. He was polite, even kind, but there was a carefulness to the way he spoke to me, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, or hearing the wrong answer. And I didn't blame him. The truth was, I didn't know how to fix this. Every time I tried to think of the right words to say, I ended up back at the same question Daniel had asked me that night. Would you still be here if I fell apart? I hated that I didn't have an answer. One night, as I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I found myself thinking about my parents. My father had been the opposite of Daniel in every way. Unreliable, unpredictable, always chasing the next. Big thing. My mother had loved him fiercely, despite all his flaws, but love hadn't been enough to keep them together. I remembered the day she'd packed up our things and left, her face set in a mask of determination as she loaded our lives into the back of a borrowed van. She'd spent the next decade working 2 jobs to make ends meet, always chasing a stability that seemed just out of reach. I'd promised myself I'd never end up like her, that I'd find a life that was steady and secure, where I wouldn't have to worry about what tomorrow might bring. But now, lying there in the dark, I wondered if I'd let that promise shape my entire life. Had I built my relationship with Daniel on love, or had I clung to him because he represented everything I thought I needed? The thought was too painful to dwell on, so I pushed it aside and rolled over, closing my eyes and willing myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Daniel moving around downstairs. I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where he was standing by the counter, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Morning," I said quietly. "Morning," he replied without looking up. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to bridge the growing chasm between us. Finally, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Daniel, can we talk?" He glanced up at me, his expression wary but not unkind. "Sure," he said, setting his mug down. "What's on your mind?" I sat down at the table, my hands clasped, tightly in front of me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice unsteady. "About us. About everything you said." He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. And I think you're right," I admitted, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I think I've leaned on you in ways I didn't even realize. And maybe I haven't always seen you for who you are, because I've been so focused on what you represent." He didn't say anything, but his expression softened slightly, and I took that as a sign to keep going. "I've been scared, Daniel," I said, my voice breaking. "Scared of what it would mean to let go of the safety you give me. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I don't see you." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Claire, I don't doubt that you love me, but I need to know that you love me, not the version of me you've built up in your head." "I do," I said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I swear I do. And I want to prove it to you. I want to do whatever it takes to show you that this isn't just about stability or security. It's about you." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then let's start there." It wasn't a resolution, not exactly. But it was something. And as we stood there in the quiet kitchen, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Starting over was harder than I expected. There was no grand gesture, no single conversation that could fix the cracks in our foundation. Instead, it was a slow, awkward process of rebuilding trust, one small, tentative step at a time. We began by talking more, really talking. Not just about bills or schedules or surface-level things, but about the fears and doubts we'd both been carrying. Daniel told me how it felt to always be the one holding things together, how the pressure of being steady had started to feel like a prison. I told him about my parents, about the promises I'd made to myself, and the ways they'd shaped my choices, even when I didn't realize it. Those conversations were messy and uncomfortable, but they were necessary. One night, as we sat together on the couch, Daniel turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in weeks. "Do you remember the first time I took you to the lake?" I blinked, surprised by the question. "Of course I do. You made me paddle that ridiculous canoe while you pretended to fish." He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I wasn't pretending. I caught one fish, a small one." "A minnow doesn't count," I teased, a smile tugging at my lips. For a moment it felt like old times, like the weight between us had lifted, even if only for a little while. But then his expression turned serious again. "Do you know why I took you there?" he asked. I shook my head. "Because you seemed so closed off when we first started dating," he said quietly. "Like you were scared to let anyone see the real you. I thought maybe if I got you out of your comfort zone, you'd let your guard down." "And did it work?" I asked, my voice softer now. He nodded. "It did. For the first time, I felt like I was seeing the real Claire, the one who laughs too loud and gets competitive over stupid things like who can paddle faster." I smiled at the memory, but his words left me unsettled. Had I let that version of myself slip away? "Daniel," I began hesitantly, "do you feel like I've changed since then?" He considered the question for a moment before answering. I think we both have. But change isn't the problem, Claire. It's that sometimes it feels like you're holding back, like you're afraid to let me see all of you. I looked down at my hands, his words striking a chord I wasn't ready to face. I guess I have been, I admitted, but not because I don't trust you. It's because I'm scared that if I show you all my flaws, you'll realize I'm not worth the effort. He reached out, gently taking my hand in his. Claire, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be honest with me about what you want, what you need. I can't be your safety net if I don't even know what I'm catching. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. For the first time, I realized how much I'd been holding back, not just from Daniel, but from myself. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't undo the mistakes I'd made, but I could start making different choices. I began by tackling something I'd been avoiding for months: my finances. Since losing my job 2 years ago, I'd let Daniel take the lead on everything, convincing myself it was easier that way. But deep down, I knew it was a way of avoiding the shame I felt about my own failures. I spent hours sorting through bills, bank statements, and overdue notices, creating a plan to pay down my debts and contribute more to our household. It was overwhelming and humbling, but it also felt good, like I was finally taking responsibility for my own life. That evening, when Daniel came home, I showed him what I'd been working on. This is a start, I said, sliding the papers across the table. I want to do better. I want to carry my share of the weight. He looked over the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set them down and looked at me. This means a lot, Claire, he said. But I don't just need you to carry your share. I need us to carry it together. I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I can do that. I want to do that. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally on the same page. But as hopeful as I was, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still questions left unanswered. Questions about what had brought us here in the first place, and whether we were strong enough to rebuild from the ground up. The following weeks were marked by an uneasy balance between progress and uncertainty. Daniel and I were talking more openly, and I was making a conscious effort to meet him halfway, but there was still a fragility to our connection. It felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and everything could fall apart again. One evening, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the quiet rhythm of our footsteps filled the space between us. I've been thinking, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. About what? I asked, glancing at him. About us, he replied, his voice steady but serious. About what you said that night in the kitchen, how you're scared I'll see all your flaws and decide you're not worth it. I tensed, bracing myself for what was coming. I don't want you to think you have to earn my love, he continued. That's not what this is about for me. It's never been about that. Then what is it about? I asked softly, stopping to face him. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. It's about feeling like I'm not just here to catch you when you fall. I need to know that you're here for me too. That if I stumble, you won't run. His words hit me like a wave, and I realized he was right. I'd spent so much time leaning on Daniel that I'd never truly considered what it would mean to support him in return. You're right, I said, my voice trembling. I haven't been the partner you deserve. I've been so focused on my own fears and insecurities that I haven't thought about yours. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. We've both made mistakes, Claire, but if we're going to move forward, we have to be willing to let go of the past. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I want to move forward. I want us to be stronger than we were before. But I need you to be honest with me too. If there's anything you're holding back, I want to hear it." He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "There is something," he admitted. "When you called me your safety net, it wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the realization that maybe I've been hiding behind that role because it's easier than being vulnerable." I stared at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've always prided myself on being the one who has it all together," he said. "But the truth is, I don't. There are days when I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, but I don't say anything because I don't want to burden you or anyone else." His confession left me speechless. I'd always seen Daniel as unshakable, the steady force in our lives. Hearing him admit to his own struggles was both heartbreaking and humbling. "I had no idea," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, "and that's on me. I've spent so much time trying to protect you from my own fears that I ended up building walls between us." We stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over us. Finally, I reached out and wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. "I don't need you to protect me," I said. "I just need you to be real with me. If you're struggling, I want to know. I want to help you the way you've always helped me." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes filled, with a mixture of relief and vulnerability. "I want that too," he said. We continued our walk in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, one that felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time in months, I felt like we were truly seeing each other, flaws and all. But as much as I wanted to believe we were on the right track, I couldn't ignore the lingering doubts in the back of my mind. Could we really rebuild what had been broken, or were we just delaying the inevitable? Those questions would have to wait. For now, I was content to focus on the present, one step at a time. A week later, Daniel suggested we spend the weekend at the lake where we'd shared so many of our early memories. At first, I hesitated. The lake felt like a symbol of everything we used to be, and I wasn't sure I could face it now, with all our scars laid bare. But Daniel insisted, and I realized this was his way of trying to move forward, of creating space for us to reconnect. When we arrived, the air was crisp, and the water shimmered under the afternoon sun. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the rickety porch swing where we'd once sat, talking late into the night. Daniel unloaded the car while I wandered down to the dock, letting the familiar sights and sounds wash over me. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore, the distant call of a loon, it all felt like a time capsule, frozen in a simpler era of our lives. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Daniel's voice broke through my reverie, and I turned to see him standing a few feet behind me, his hands in his pockets. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," I admitted, gesturing toward the lake. "It feels the same, but we're not." He stepped closer, his gaze thoughtful. "That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. Change doesn't have to mean losing something. Sometimes it means finding something new." I wanted to believe that was true. That evening, as we sat by the fire pit, Daniel handed me a mug of hot cocoa and took the seat beside me. For a while, we just stared into the flames, the crackle of the fire filling the silence between us. "You know," he said finally, his voice soft. "I wasn't going to bring this up, but I've been thinking about something." "What is it?" I asked, my heart sinking at the serious note in his tone. "That night, when we had that fight," he began, "you said something about how you've always seen me as your safety net. I keep wondering, was that all I was to you? In the beginning?" His question stung, but I knew he deserved an honest answer. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "When we first met, I was a mess," I admitted. I'd just gotten out of a relationship that left me feeling completely untethered, and I was desperate for someone, to ground me. You were that person, Daniel. You made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt in years. He nodded, his expression unreadable. But was it just that? Was it just safety you were looking for? No, I said firmly. It started that way, maybe. But it didn't stay that way. I fell in love with you, Daniel. You. Not just the stability you gave me, but your kindness, your humor, the way you make me feel like I'm not alone in the world. He studied me for a long moment, then reached for my hand, lacing his fingers with mine. That's all I needed to hear, he said quietly. The fire crackled between us, its warmth wrapping around us like a cocoon. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope, really hope, that we could find our way back to each other. The next morning, we decided to take the canoe out on the lake. The water was calm, and the autumn leaves reflected in its surface like a painting. As we paddled, Daniel and I fell into an easy rhythm, our movements synchronized in a way that felt almost symbolic. At one point, he stopped paddling and let the canoe drift, looking out at the horizon. "Claire," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Yeah?" He turned to me, his expression serious but not unkind. "I don't want us to keep circling the same questions forever. We've both been scared. Of failing. Of losing each other. But we need to decide if we're willing to take the risk and rebuild, no matter how hard it gets." I swallowed hard, his words cutting straight to the heart of everything we'd been avoiding. "I am," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "I'm willing to take the risk." "Are you?" He nodded, a small determined smile playing at his lips. "I am. But it's going to take more than words, Claire. We have to show up for each other. Every day, no matter what." "We will," I promised. And for the first time, I truly meant it. As we sat there in the middle of the lake, surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We weren't fixed, and we weren't perfect, but we were finally on the same page. The drive home from the lake was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of tension. It was the kind of silence that comes when words have already done their work. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand as we pulled into the driveway, a small gesture that said everything we needed to say. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm. Not a perfect one, but one that felt more balanced. I started taking on more responsibilities at home and actively worked on rebuilding my career. It wasn't easy to confront the things I'd let slide for so long, but with every small step, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable. Daniel noticed, too. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he stopped mid-task and looked at me with a mix of pride and something deeper, something unspoken. "You're different," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Different how?" I asked, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "You're not holding back anymore," he said. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you talk about your plans. It's like you've finally decided to stop hiding." I smiled, a little self-conscious under his gaze. I guess I realized that if I wanted things to change, I had to change too. I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to fix things for me. He nodded, stepping closer. "I'm proud of you, Claire. But you don't have to do it all on your own, you know. We're in this together." The weight of his words settled over me, warm and reassuring. For so long, I'd seen Daniel as my safety net, the one who caught me when I fell. Now, I understood that being partners meant more than that. It meant catching each other, lifting each other up when the other couldn't stand. One night, as we sat on the couch with a glass of wine, Daniel surprised me with an old scrapbook he'd found in the back of a closet. It was filled with photos from the early days of our relationship. Road trips, birthdays, lazy Sunday mornings. "Do you remember this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of us laughing in a diner booth, a milkshake and 2 straws between us. I nodded, my chest tightening with nostalgia. "You told the waiter it was my birthday just so we could get the free dessert." "And it worked," he said with a grin. We spent hours flipping through the pages, reminiscing about the life we'd built together. It was a reminder of all the joy we'd shared, even amid the struggles. By the time we closed the scrapbook, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Like we were writing the next chapter of our story, one day at a time. Still, there were moments of doubt, moments when old insecurities tried to creep back in. But instead of shutting down or pulling away, I made a conscious effort to face them head on. And for the first time, I saw Daniel doing the same. One evening, as we lay in bed, he turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about why we made it through all of this?" I considered his question carefully. "Because we love each other," I said. "And because we're finally willing to fight for that love even when it's hard." He nodded, a thoughtful smile playing at his lips. "I think it's more than that, though. I think we finally realized that love isn't just about feeling safe. It's about taking risks, about trusting that even when we stumble, we'll figure out how to stand back up together." His words stayed with me long after he fell asleep, echoing in the quiet of the room. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through the windows, I woke up with a sense of clarity. Our journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But for the first time, I felt like we were both fully committed to the same goal. Not just surviving, but thriving. As I watched Daniel pour coffee in the kitchen, humming softly to himself, I realized something else. We'd stopped looking back at what we'd lost and started focusing on what we could build. It wasn't a perfect story, and it didn't have a tidy ending, but it was ours, and that was enough. If this story resonated with you, let me know with a like or comment. Have you ever had to confront your own fears and flaws to rebuild a relationship? I'd love to hear your story and how you found your way forward. Thank you for listening.